Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give everyone a moment to file in. We are so happy to have you here. And it's 4 p.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Althea, and thank you once again for joining us for this 30-minute webinar in our Research to Policy Critical Conversations in Language Education series. This year's theme is technologically mediated learning in a multilingual context. We are examining the impact of technological innovation on learning in multilingual settings with a particular focus on AI. Today's webinar is Responsible AI in Assessment, and we will be speaking with Jill Burstein, Principal Assessment Scientist at the Dual Language English Test Research, who will be joined by Micheline Shaloub-Deville, a Cal Board Trustee, and Anna Zilberberg, Senior Director of Language Assessment and Instructional Research at Cal. We are recording this webinar today, and we will post the recording on our website after the event. Before you begin, please mute your microphones to avoid interruptions. You can activate closed captioning by pressing the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. This event is provided as a public service. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed belong solely to the guest speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of our organization. Our panel comprises esteemed experts who work at the intersection of research, policy, and practice in language education and language access and equity. You can learn more about them on the webinar's page. We will share the link. My apologies. We will share the link in the chat. We encourage you to ask questions via the Q&A box throughout the call. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of our discussion. It is an excellent opportunity to tap into the wealth of knowledge we are fortunate to have here today. Also, please click the chat button at the bottom of your screen to share your thoughts and comments anytime. Try it out now by letting us know where you're listening from today. I will now pass the microphone to our facilitators.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you happen to be around the world. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I ask my questions, as I said, or as Althea said, as a member of the Cal Board Trustee. And I have known you, Jill, now for a number of years, back when you worked at ETS. So it's a pleasure to see you at the Duolingo English test and for our paths to cross again here at the webinar. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and maybe background as it specifically applies to research and policy with regard to AI and standardized testing?
Yeah, sure. So it's great to see you again, Micheline, and thank you for the invitation, Cal and Anna and Althea. So I'm really happy to be here to discuss more about responsible AI in assessment. So as you said, I worked at ATS for many years, and I worked in automated writing evaluation as a computational linguist, where I spent some time also thinking about responsible AI. And now my work at the Duolingo English test, I'm an assessment scientist, and I lead a validity research team for the Duolingo English test. The Duolingo English test uses AI extensively. We use it different models for automated item generation, for scoring, for security. Responsible AI is a part of validity. Yeah. And so we have developed responsible AI standards as part of our validity research effort. And these standards are actually being referred to as policy in new I want to say guidelines about responsible AI from the assessment community. So the Association for Test Publishers has recently published their thoughts about responsible AI and assessment response. So just to do some level setting before we get into discussing policy, responsible AI just is is an area, as a field that where we work to mitigate harm in general for anything that's AI powered, but in our case for AI powered assessments, right? And it provides guidelines, like very concrete guidelines for safe use in AI. It's grounded in ethical principles, so anyone from assessment will be familiar with things like validity, fairness, transparency. There are, of course, more principles. I can talk about them in a bit when I talk about our responsible AI standards. It creates practices, so not just the ideals about responsible AI, but also practices that go along with that. And that is part of, I think, the larger building policy, responsible AI policy for assessment, is making sure that you have these principles, but they're also tied to actual practices, that you're using when you're developing your test and administering your test. And something that we should all acknowledge, I'm sure many people in the audience are familiar with this, is that responsible AI has now achieved global importance. And there is policy being developed from around the world, in the US with the White House and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their AI risk management framework, the Council of European Union AI Act, the UK Responsible AI Toolkit, the Canadian government has Responsible AI, Australia and South Africa just released a national AI policy framework. And so I think, responsible AI is something that needs to be developed as part of assessment policies now. So beyond our standards, our typical standards that guide how we think about validity and fairness and transparency on tests that have been developed fully by humans and scored by humans, AI-powered tests really need a responsible AI set of standards as part of policy. And so to that end, the Duolingo English test has a policy for responsible AI that is driven by their standards, and we've developed these standards as part of our research effort. And our standards in terms of ethical principles represent validity and reliability, where we think about things like, making sure that the test works as is expected. So human system agreement with regard to automated scorings and for speaking and writing. And we have a fairness standard, so the ethical principle of fairness, making it increases access and manages bias. Our privacy and security standard, making sure that test takers and content are secure, test administration is secure, that test taker data is protected. Now we have things to think about, like data being shared with third parties for building large language models or feeding into large language models. And then accountability and transparency standard, where you need to document and disseminate to make sure that your stakeholders know how how they're interacting with the test, how the test takers are interacting with AI, and that people who use the scores, how has AI been used to generate the scores? So I think that building these standards is now an essential part of how we form assessment policy. So
just before I yield the floor to my colleague Anna, I just want to make sure, because this is such a central point. When you're talking about AI and the DET, which is a digital test, right? Digital first.
Yes.
You're saying that there is human in the loop, that you continue to emphasize the importance of having human beings, professional, who are monitoring different aspects and participating in different aspects of the process.
Yes, absolutely. So I think building on to the responsible AI policy, so for instance, the fairness standard, right? We have a human review of the automatically generated content to make sure that toxic language is removed. Not unsimilar to what you would do if humans are writing test items, but machines may generate hallucinations or things that humans might not do, right? And some things can be subtle, right? But a person would know, the machine might not know. And so, yes, we have to have human review in terms of reviewing content, in terms of making sure that the scores that come out are valid and fair, in the same way you would with the human, when we weren't using AI powered, for everything that we do. So yeah, definitely very important.
Great. Jill, well, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to meet you, and it's a pleasure to have you as a guest speaker at our webinar series. My question is the following. This year we are exploring topics that seem to fit the categories access, representation, systems, and structures or policy.
Mm-hmm.
In which category would today's topic fit, and why?
So thank you for asking that question. And I just, I prepared a slide in as I was thinking this through. And I think that really we can address pretty much all of those topics, because I think that responsible AI really does impact access, representation, systems, and policy, as we were just discussing. AI really has the capacity or the ability to broaden access, right? So if you think about a remote secure testing, this is made possible by the fact that we have automated item generation, and we can generate larger item banks. We can keep refreshing item banks. So in terms of security, if items are leaked, we can create more items. And so the automated item generation really helps with that. It also helps you have automated scoring, so that allows for on-demand testing, right? And so you can be at home at your computer, taking a test, having it scored automatically. It lowers the cost. That's another thing that helps with access. Being able to, an example that's not here, but thinking about, other aspects of security. I mean, being able to take the test at home is really helped by AI, because you can basically, you can do things to keep, you can use AI to keep the test secure, the way that people onboard onto the test. And so, this really broadens access. It allows people to take things that, take the test at home, not have to travel to test centers. It allows them, it affords that, the test can be cheaper. And so this really does broaden access, but we need to be responsible about it. And so that's why we have standards in place. So you have access, but you have to make sure that it is secure. You have increased access, but you have to make sure it's secure. And then in terms of representation, attention to representation increases, you have to take diversity into account. It's really critical. We have to make sure that there's representative data for system building. So when you're building AI models, you want to make sure that the populations that you're interested in are represented in the data. So for instance, if you have to score responses from people who are speaking English with different accents, right? You need to make sure that their accents are represented in the data so that you recognize them and you make sure that you can score them accurately. And from the flip side, you need to make sure that you have human raters, people who actually do annotation of different writing samples and speaking samples. You want to make sure that you have people who are doing the scoring, who are reading the writing, and they're listening to the speaking, and they represent the population who's taking the test, and they have sensitivity toward different ways that people may express themselves, either in writing or speaking, right? So responsible AI, I think it really impacts that, and diversity is really critical in that context. And then in terms of systems, so different AI models really impact test development and security, and also the environment. So AI and tech is really transforming testing. The AI is allowing us to have innovative item types and more interactive item types. It expands validity checks. So we have, in terms of responsibility, we have methods to identify test takers, make sure, using AI, make sure that they are who they say they are, identifying plagiarism or cheating behaviors. So now we have to think about, in terms of responsible AI, things like ChatGPT and plagiarism, which we didn't before. How do we detect if someone's using something like ChatGPT to help them write something or respond to something while they're taking the test? And just more generally, thinking about the responsible AI and environmental impact. So at-home testing, for instance, involves less travel, right? So those are some things that we can think about. And being able to have the at-home testing, it also diversifies the population because it allows more people from different contexts who may not otherwise be able to travel and take a test to actually take the test. So it creates a more diverse population of people who can apply, who can take tests and apply to universities. And then in terms of policy, I think there are ethical considerations we have to think of in policy and how, AI education, making sure we minimize harms in terms of policy. And I think I might be talking about this a bit later in our discussion, but I think it's really important to me anyway that we think about how to integrate assessment validity with domain agnostic responsible AI frameworks. So essentially, the assessment community has been developing their own validity frameworks and guidelines and even uses of AI over time. But there's also the responsible AI ethics community and more domain agnostic frameworks such as the NIST's the NIST responsible AI framework that talks about responsible AI more generally. And so when governments are writing about their policies, they're thinking about these more general domain agnostic frameworks. And we have to be able to kind of talk to each other. And so it's important that the assessment community, I think, as part of building their frameworks, acknowledges these domain agnostic policies. So it allows, communication between the different disciplines. But it also addresses, there's some things that we need to address that are not necessarily assessment. They're non-assessment issues. Like, does the data end up with some third party who's using it for training data? Or, are there issues with the environment kind of thing? And so I think that as we're building policy and thinking about policy, we need to think about these other issues. And building AI literacy is also something that we need to think about, I think. Because the people who are working on the tests, developing the tests, reviewing the tests, it's important for them to understand what it is that these different capabilities are doing, and in order to be very effective in their jobs, I think.
Thank you, Jill. That was a tour de force and quite a quick.
Sorry.
Yeah, covering a lot of issues here, and I'm sure our audience would like to probe you on each and every single item that you have mentioned. This is such a hot area and an important area today. I guess I'm interested in issues of policy and changes to policy because of AI. And you hinted at some of this in your answer to Anna. So I was wondering if you can speak more about changes to policy that you'd like to see in this domain. Maybe policy and practice as well.
Yeah, so I think that what is happening now is that the assessment community has acknowledged the need for, reaching out to the responsible AI community more broadly. And now with like ATP, the Assessment for Test Publishers, have come up with their guidelines. They're pointing to other standards like Duolingo English test standards, and ETS has policy. All the, they're referring to responsible AI now as part of the policy. So I think we're already seeing a shift in embracing sort of a broader framework to bring into our world of assessment. I talked a little bit about, this helps with communication across communities, talking to governments, understanding the regulations and how to address them. Not only with the standards, but also with practices, as you say. So when you build responsible AI standards, you need to make sure that as you're building the assessment, as you're administering the assessment, that you have practices that go along with each of these policies, with each of the standards. And so I think in terms of policy, I think we have to think about who's going to be building the standards? Is it every individual testing organization? Is it the professional communities? Is that part of their standards to build the policy? And I think these are open questions, unfortunately, that I don't have, because it's really, this is not a new field, but it is a new field. I mean, responsible AI has been something that has been in assessment for a while, even though we may not be calling it that. When I worked at ETS building the first automated writing scoring systems, what responsible AI meant was what it means in any assessment, which is making sure that the score, wasn't disadvantaging certain groups, making sure that it agreed with human raters, to a large extent. So making sure that the score itself was valid, but also communicating what was going on in the system to the world. So making sure that you published about it and opened the black box so it wasn't a black box. So transparency, right? And I think we're continuing to do all of those things, but I think as a community, we just have to figure out who's rating what and what to take from what. And, as a digital first test, meaning a test that uses AI extensively and was built, was sort of born from AI, we built these standards as an example of what other organizations can do. If they want, they can certainly borrow from it. Different tests are probably going to may have overlap, but they may have differences. But yeah, so I hope that responds to your question.
Well, while we're waiting for people to ask questions, I just want to jump in. And one thing perhaps you have not brought up, Jill, but given where I sit, I'm faculty at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, maybe another important change is in terms of practices with training the next generation of professionals. We need to start thinking about how to incorporate AI research thinking into our curriculum so that we are able to develop professionals who are ready to hit the ground running with regard to AI and what it means for test development, research, and design. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think that's part of the broader AI literacy challenge, right? And I think people are we're starting to see that come out. ETS just wrote a report on AI, on AI literacy. I think there was another one that came out. I forget who exactly published that, but I think we're going to hear a lot and see a lot more about AI literacy, which I think is what you're talking about. And so when I'm thinking about literacy, I'm thinking make sure that the people who are humans in the loop are literate about what they're. Oh, I just made balloons happen. I waved my hands a certain way. I'm talking about the people in our organization, but I think in your context, AI literacy means training the next generation of professionals and, people who are going to work in language assessment.
Okay. So wonderful input so far, Jill. Thank you so much. I wonder, AI in general is such a hot topic, and responsible AI is something that a lot of people are very interested about, and folks working in assessment and education more generally. I wonder, from your point of view, what call to action would you offer to our audience?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the big call to action, the broad call to action, depending on who you are, is the community really needs to think about who needs standards, who's going to write them, who's going to participate. Is it just going to be the assessment community? Are we going to let other people in? Are we going to talk to AI ethicists and computer scientists and kind of bring them into our world to help us with the standards, which I think is really important. But to the audience more broadly, because I'm not sure quite who's out there, if it's students or faculty or people from industry or just people who are interested in general, I think it's really important to read and educate yourself. Just learn as much as you can because it's all happening so quickly. There's just an overload. Every day if you look on LinkedIn or you have a feed, you're getting more and more about the hype, but also, substantive information about responsible AI and assessment and education more broadly. I think you are going to be sharing my slides, which have links to, if you want to get started, if you haven't really looked into this, I think there are a couple of really good resources out there that you can get started with. Two of them I was able to share the links. One of them you'll have to find on your own because it's not really available. But I think AI literacy, just building your own, starting to become literate if you're not already, and just your education in this field, if you're going to be working in this field, is really, really essential. And your participation. So however it is that you can participate, right? So our standards, for instance, are open for public comment, right? You can go to the standards, you can access them, you can see where to send your comments to. I'm sure there are other standards out there or other documents, that are open for public comment. It's not that unusual. And then attending webinars and conferences, just anything where you can learn, because there is a lot of information out there, but it is important to learn what you can, even if it's a little bit at a time. And whether you're a student or you're a faculty or you're in industry, think about how your expertise, either now or in the future, can play a role in responsible AI for assessment. So that's how I would respond to that question.
Great. Thank you so much. I could share a question from the audience if we have a couple of minutes.
Sure.
So, one of the questions is, we are talking about diversity and representation through AI and natural database use. How would you say this impacts the phonetic input that Duolingo uses? I'm a user of the app myself and find it lacking depending on the language I'm studying.
Well, I work so Duolingo has an app, and that's sort of everybody's, more people are familiar with the app. I don't work on the app side. I work for the Duolingo English test. And so I'm not exactly sure how what it is exactly that what technologies they use, but I know that they do use speech recognition. And so whatever the speech recognizer is using, but I'm sure that they're continuing to build it as they get data from users and improve it. So I think it's, it all has to do with the speech recognizer and sort of whatever features are being accessed from people's speech. And the more people who use it with the more different kinds of accents, it also depends what language you're studying. I don't know what language you're studying, whoever asked the question, whether it's English or another language.
Thank you. There's another question about DET specifically. Are the test takers of the DET conversing with AI or just responding to questions? You had mentioned considering accents of test takers, and I wonder if there are also considerations for cultural competency.
Yeah, there are for cultural competencies. So part of the human review, so let's say that the system, our automated item generation system or passage generation system generates some kind of content that's not very culturally sensitive. Either because it's, I don't know, they're talking about some kind of food that you would only know about if you lived in a certain country, or it's something that could be possibly offensive. That's where people come in, and we have a set of guidelines that people look at and they review to make sure that there is cultural sensitivity in the content that we end up putting on the test.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd like to give a big thank you to our panelists today. This was very engaging, very exciting topic. Unfortunately, this is the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that we can see you at the next one. Please watch your emails for a recording of this webinar. You can also find information on the website. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.